Hey, so I made a video a while back when I was in the country about the deterioration of relations between Canada and China over this Huawei incident, or this Huawei affair, let's say. The CEO of Huawei was arrested in Vancouver and she was charged with a US arrest warrant of violating sanctions against Iran by misleading banks about transactions. It's a complex situation, but what isn't complex is the fact that the situation has deteriorated. That's very obvious. So, a Canadian man, a Canadian national, Robert Lloyd Schellenberg, has been sentenced to death for drug smuggling. Now, on the surface, this wouldn't be surprising because China and other Asian countries do take a very hardline approach on drug offences. Indonesia, Thailand, other countries, it would either be life imprisonment or the death penalty. So, in itself, that's not surprising. But what's disturbing about this is it's so blatantly petty vindictiveness on the part of Beijing. What they're doing is trying to send out a message to Canada that oh, well, you arrest our businesswoman, then we execute your citizens arbitrarily. So what happened was Mr. Schellenberg had appealed a 15-year sentence. Prosecutors said that was too lenient, and he's been sentenced to death. I don't know what date the execution is scheduled for, but I think it will be, unless I'm mistaken, this will be the first execution of a Westerner in China for about a decade. I know there was a British national put to death in the mid 2000s, and that was controversial because he had learning difficulties. Let me just get something out of the way, just so that no one's left in any doubt. If Mr. Schellenberg is guilty of drug offences, if he was drug trafficking, he should face justice. He should serve time. I think drugs are evil. I think they cause a lot of problems. So if he absolutely was guilty with solid evidence, then I think he should serve a custodial sentence because drugs ruin lives. But definitely not the death penalty. I've never favoured the death penalty for drug offences. The reason being that it's I see it different. I see being a drug trafficker, a drug mule, as being very different from a high level drug lord. I also think that it's it's a bad thing. People shouldn't do it, but to put someone to death, to kill someone, is just too excessive. Particularly as the Chinese regime isn't going to, they're not going to give his family any details. They're going to leave them in the dark. It's a callous, nasty, vicious totalitarian regime, and this is just the latest example of that. They're not putting this man to death because it's a law. They're putting him to death because they want to take a swipe at Canada. And I think, frankly, that is utterly disgusting, using a man's life to score political points. Um, that's what they seem to be doing. And, if people say that's not the case, I would say, well, why now? Why are they sentencing him to death at this time? He's a Canadian national. So, join the dots. Clearly, they're trying to send out a message, and I feel awful for the guy's family. I'm not going to say he's innocent. If he done it, he got himself into that mess. But I feel sorry for his family because the death penalty punishes them, and I think it's wrong in this circumstance. Now, of course, China is a country which leads the world in death penalty rates. By some estimates, it kills thousands of people every year, or executes thousands of people every year. Kill, execute, depending on where your line is on the death penalty. I'm generally against the death penalty. I can see its merit for the very worst of cases, like child murder, child rape, that sort of thing. But I do think that the death penalty is flawed, particularly in a country like China, which has very little rule of law, is extremely corrupt, and there's very dubious due process. Um, I mean, I've heard horror stories that are, chilling. Um, but just to think of the wider issues here, well, that's that. I think that's disgusting. But I really think it's come to the point now where things have really got bad over the last year. It, regarding Britain, the situation certainly not deteriorated anything like it has with Russia. But I think this affects all Western countries. Right now, Canada is the big enemy, but it could be Canada today, it will be Britain tomorrow, it will be Australia the next day. This is something that affects all Western nations because we have shared values. And as far as I'm concerned, an attack on Canada, which is what what China is doing. And let's not forget the three Canadian nationals that they've arbitrarily arrested and accused of spying. This is an attack on Canada. As far as I'm concerned, that's an attack on Britain. It's an attack on France. It's an attack on the United States. It's an attack on the Netherlands. It's an attack on every Western democracy. And I think the West needs to collectively support Canada and speak out against this. The Chinese regime is powerful and is very arrogant, but they're not stupid. I think they're testing the ground, seeing how far they can go. I honestly believe if all the Western countries kind of got together and said, enough is enough, we're no longer going to take Chinese bullying, this situation where Chinese nationals think they can do whatever they want because they have links to the Communist Party. And like I say, at that level, the Huawei executives, there's absolutely no way someone could get to that level in China without having direct links to the Communist Party. That's why they've reacted so strongly. If we were talking about a Chinese student who'd been arrested in Canada on, I don't know, say drug offences, the Chinese wouldn't care because they're only a student. But this is because it's a Huawei executive. So therefore, she's close to the party. We need to protect our own. And that would be all very well if the Canadians were actually treating her in a very bad way, but they're not. They're giving her due process. She's got freedom of the city of Vancouver. They're treating her in a very humane way, which is a lot more than can be said for the way they're treating the Canadian nationals, depriving them of sleep, not letting their families know the situation. It's abhorrent. Hua Chunying, who is the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, came out with the usual deflective nonsense. She's kind of become the polite face of Chinese arrogance. Um, Wang Yi is far more vocal, the foreign minister, when he had his little rant in Canada a few years ago. But there is a lot of tensions between Canada and China right now. But like I say, we shouldn't be complacent in other countries and think, oh, that's only an issue between Canada and China. This affects all Western countries. And Canada is one of the most tolerant countries on earth. It's one of the most open countries on earth. If the Canadians suddenly say, okay, we're no longer going to allow Chinese students to come to this country, we're going to block all Chinese nationals. I do think Ottawa should take quite a tough line here. And okay, people might say that's collective punishment. And I certainly don't blame all Chinese nationals for the behaviour of the government. But I do think Western countries need to send out a message because frankly we're too soft on the Chinese in my opinion. By which I mean the Chinese government. I don't think we should necessarily, what I've just said, it's just an example. I'm not saying it's necessarily the best approach, but we need to send out a message collectively. Unfortunately, in Britain, we're so tied up with this Brexit thing that we can't focus on anything else. And that's one of many reasons why Brexit is, I'll be glad to see the end of it because it ties us up from dealing with other issues. But when I left the country, I knew the situation was deteriorating, and I don't want to give all the details of what I know in this video, but let's just say it's. I would not be half surprised if what the Chinese government is doing is gradually trying to wean out all Western influence. So they're going to get to a point where they're going to block all Western teachers, Western businesses, and rather than being a reformist, Xi Jinping's going to close China again except in certain respects. I mean, we see Chinese kind of neo-colonialism in Africa, ironically. For a country that likes to preach about Western colonialism, what's happening in Africa right now is China's basically buying up the continent. I read a report yesterday about buying fishing rights off, I believe it was Mozambique and Tanzania. So China is clearly throwing its weight around in the world, and this is coming from a country that loves to talk about minding our internal affairs. Um, So whenever foreigners criticize human rights in China or other issues, not to mention the massive crackdown that's going on in Xinjiang right now, whenever foreigners mention that, the line is always, oh, this is our internal affairs, mind your own business, or biased Western media. But what is the Chinese regime doing? They are interfering in the sovereignty of Western nations by trying to stir up the Chinese diaspora with nationalistic sentiments. They do it through Confucius Institutes, they do it through other mechanisms, and Australia woke up to this a long time ago. Australia has been very outspoken. It's time that other Western countries finally start standing up to these communist thugs, because as far as I'm concerned, it is a thuggish regime. It's very, very corrupt. It's very cruel, and it's incredibly dishonest. And I have nothing but contempt for the Chinese government, to be quite blunt about it, because it would be one thing if they just had iron control in China, that's bad enough. But the fact that they are now trying to get this sort of ideology influencing on other countries, um, and you have this very powerful tandem of China and Russia. They're not directly working together at the moment, but that would be a very powerful alliance. The West needs to get its act together. And unfortunately, when you have Trump praising dictators like Xi Jinping, it's an embarrassment. If we cannot trust the leader of the free world to speak out about these things, then it's going to fall on other leaders. And I don't agree with Justin Trudeau on everything. I don't like a lot of the positions he's taken in during his premiership. But on this issue, I believe Western governments need to back Trudeau absolutely, because this is just abhorrent. So, unfortunately, I haven't looked at all the videos regarding the case of Mr. Schellenberg, because they'll just depress me. Because it'll be full of people, Chinese nationals, saying things like, oh, the Westerners getting what he deserves, arrogant Westerners thinking they can do what they want. I just predict the comments. And then there'll be some Westerners who justify it, like, oh, their law, their land, their laws. That's all very well. Well, what about our laws? What about Chinese nationals respecting our laws? Because the trend in recent years, or over the last year, has been Chinese nationals behaving in obnoxious ways and then playing the victim. For example, the Kong Lin incident in Birmingham. When instead of apologizing for her obnoxious behavior, CGTN and the Chinese embassy demanded apologies. Demanded apologies. I am sick and tired of the Chinese government demanding apologies from Western countries. It's about time Western countries demand apologies. I appreciate that Mr. Trudeau has to tread carefully, because reckless comments can, put Mr. Schellenberg's case into jeopardy. But I think this regime's going to execute the man, and it's awful for his family. Um, if they do that, if they go ahead and do that, then the gloves are off, and I really think Trudeau needs to speak up, be vocal, and more than demand apologies. I think Canada needs to slap sanctions on China, and I think other Western countries should follow suit. I honestly believe we should recall our Chinese ambassadors in London, in Washington, D.C., in Paris, in Amsterdam. I think we need to send out a message, because what we're seeing here is a long term agenda of one of the world's most authoritarian regimes trying to maneuver into a position where it could do basically anything it wants. And let's not delude ourselves. The Chinese government is very powerful. It is. But that power isn't absolute. I don't accept that it's just like this massive monolith and it's absolutely unrestrained power. There are limits and there are weaknesses. When the PLA has to make fake videos on their military prowess, that sends out a message that they're a little bit desperate. When they resort to pathetic tactics like hacking individuals' computers, sending nasty messages to human rights campaigners and so on, it actually shows a weakness. Now, I feel all of this on a personal level because I've got a lot of connections with China, and I call it my China paradox. I have a lot of affection for my Chinese friends. I've good memories from being there, but I'm also acutely aware of how things have deteriorated, and I don't know if I can ever go back, to be quite honest, because I don't know if the situation plays out to a point where Westerners are just blocked. Um, and to those Chinese nationalists who say it's xenophobic or you're demonizing the Chinese government, my point would be to do such a good job of it themselves. You know, if they're so innocent, why are they not transparent? Why are they so frightened of journalist questions? Why are they so nationalistic and defensive? It's quite simple because they are very sensitive people. And when you have sensitivity combined with totalitarianism, that's a very dangerous mix. And I've said this before, I'll say it again. I think the communist regime knows full well that ideological communism doesn't sell anymore. So Marxist Leninist ideology, it doesn't work anymore. They know that. Therefore, they rely on nationalism, and unfortunately, it works because a large number of the Chinese diaspora get influenced by this. And what happens every time there's these sort of tensions? They go out and they protest in favor of the Chinese regime. They take advantage of our tolerance to do that. And I find it rather infuriating, to be quite honest, because I think it's like coming into someone's house and slapping them in the face. That's what it feels like when I see Chinese nationalists on the streets demanding apologies from the BBC or CBC or waving their little flags and shouting about Emperor Xi. We need to stand up to this. Not about being xenophobic. It's not about targeting all Chinese people. Certainly not. You know, probably most Chinese people just go about their lives and mind their own business. But there is something going on here, and we need to be assertive about it. Um, and to those who say, Mr. Schellenberg, oh well, it's their land, their laws, I would ask you the question, why now? Okay. Also, if the death penalty exists in a number of countries, not just China. It exists in the United States as well, except in the United States it's for the worst of the worst, like serial killers and premeditated murder. In China it's arbitrary, and the death penalty is extended to, okay, serial killers, but also money offenses, drug offenses, and thousands of people are executed every year. The irony of this is that the biggest serial killer in Chinese history, arguably, was Chairman Mao. This is a man who was directly responsible for tens of millions of deaths. And what do? They put his face on money. It's perverse. I love China, but I despise the regime that runs China because I think it imprisons China. I think it's I think the Chinese communist regime is a threat to liberal democracies everywhere, and for a long time it was about, okay, they're absolute within China. But what we're seeing, especially in the Xi era, is this kind of testing the water of soft power. We see it with maritime expansionism. We see it with them buying up Africa, and there's an agenda going on here. So they can use nice, flowery diplomatic language when they talk about the golden age of Sino-British relations. But it's a facade. As far as I'm concerned, it's a facade because what we're going to see, like I say, Canada today, it will be Britain tomorrow. We need to be assertive about this, and we need to back our friends in Canada because they have shared values. And if we're silent on this, then it's to our shame. We need to collectively stand up to the arrogant, dishonest, and callous regime in Beijing.